Blizzard got a little sneaky. They balanced the game in a way they never have before, and it's the reason why Warriors aren't the most dominant on the All-Stars points. Remember, that's what this boss damage thing is. It's some kind of average of your performance across all the fights. That's All-Stars points, but it doesn't mean that if your class isn't the best on average, that it can't be the best on many things or even most things. So you might see here, you have to scroll a little bit to find the first warrior. They're 31 when you take all the bosses and you stick them in a blender and you just see what the average is, all right? And when you average all the classes together, it turns out the slush is blue. But what about on the individual fights? We see Grubbus, the first fight. There's a warrior in the top 10. Okay, so warriors very viable on Grubbus. What about the second fight? Remember, this is a really short fight, so flagellation's up the entire damn time. And what do you know? Warriors own on this fight. Okay, so far we've had two fights where Warriors have been in the top 10, and on one of them, they're like half the top 10. What about the third fight? Okay, so it's like two where we're like number one and one where we have like half the slots. Now, the last few bosses, they're not super hot for us. Turns out having things knock you around isn't very good when you're a melee class, and on these final two bosses, which is what the video is about, the Blue Man group has a lot of dominance because these guys actually have more armor. Yeah, that's right. You heard that right. The last two bosses, they have more armor. So let's talk about boss armor. And really quickly, let's talk about how it usually works in the game. There are three classifications of mobs in Classic. You have Warrior type, Caster type, and Paladin type. This is, I'm just talking about like boss mechanics, what kind of stuff it affects them, specifically armor, because this affects a lot of stuff. Now, what does this mean? If a warrior level mob would have 10 points of armor, a caster has about 7, and a paladin has about 9. These are, is like a rule of thumb. It's quite accurate though. How popular is each of these classifications of mobs in Raid? Okay, in MC, Sulfur Harbinger is the only warrior mob. All right? This is like 2% of fucking bosses. Seriously, like 2% of bosses have the max armor value for a boss. What about Caster? This is way more popular. It's like probably like 3 times more popular than Warrior. This would be like all the Salamanders in MC, and then it would be the first boss in AQ, and I also believe Kel'Thuzad in Max, and nothing else. So way more common than Warrior, but still Caster type, very uncommon. And the rest of them are Paladin. So this is like 92% of mobs. So in the majority of the game for Classic, all the mobs, all the bosses have the same armor. And what's weird is in this fucking raid, there's 3 different armor values. You see after debuffs, after debuffs, after debuffs. So people actually have a lot more armor than this. The top 5 or top 4, they have 150 armor. The Menagerie, it has 1600 after debuffs. And the final boss, Thermoplug, has 2300. Ouch. You know what this translates to? It's about 2% less damage taken. On this one, it's about 30%. And then for the final boss, it's about 39%. If you're wondering how I got to those values, this is the armor formula. It's equal to the armor of the mob divided by the armor of the mob plus 3,800. This is a magic number, 3,800 that is. It's a magic number based on the level of the attacker. It would be a different number if we were talking about level 25s or 60s, but 3,800 will be your magic number for the entirety of phase 2. Cool. So now what have we seen so far? On half the fights, warriors are like the best DPS class with, according to the data, basically. On the other half, they don't show up in the top 100 hardly at all. And we know that for the bottom half, which is where I'm talking about they're being bad, this guy, who knows why, the last two, armor screaming to be the answer. Okay, let's go check how hard we're hitting per auto attack and see, is this actually mapping up with what we know about the armor? Okay, first fight, 440. Second fight, 540. Let's write that down. So 440, 540. Wait, what? These guys supposed to have the same amount. Why is this so much higher? Well, this is just because it's short, okay? So this guy has flagellation up for like this entire fight. That's the reason this is 540 and it's higher than the others. We'll see the next fight, Crowd Pummeler, it goes right back down. We get to 420. Okay, so we'll write that down. Notice like, yeah, okay, so these are all pretty similar. 440, 420, not similar for 540, but we understand why that would be. Electrocutioner, yet again, pretty normal amount, like 380. Okay, maybe you're thinking, wow, isn't that kind of a big difference? We have like 440 up here, 380 down here. Yeah, well, let's say this is like what we would expect to get. Well, then that means the difference between these two, like peak to peak, it's 40, but it's out of like 420. Okay, it's like 9% variance. Who cares? That makes some real sense to us. Now let's see. We should expect that these last two guys that they're a bit lower. And it looks a little weird here. This is actually like 390, so it's not really like lower by much. And then for the final boss, I'll check that out in a second, but it is 330. Interesting. And so we can see, yeah, it does look like the damage goes down when you approach the last few mobs. And this, of course, is not great for our DPS as warriors. But should you be worried? Well, half the fights you're already doing killer on. So I don't really think you have too much to worry about. There's 3 fights where you're not doing killer. Well, most likely we'll scale a little better from here than the other classes. Perhaps you're not convinced enough where we'll be able to overtake them on these last 3 bosses. That might be the case. But remember, this armor effect, this hasn't really been used by Blizzard before as a balancing thing in the classic version of the game. This is this chart down at the bottom with the paladin, caster, and warrior stuff. Like, this is how armor was in classic. So I think it's very possible that they're going to change these numbers. Would they make them go up? Maybe, because it could nerf hunters too. Maybe. But I really don't think they're going to raise the armor values. I think that it's going to, at worst, stay the same. But quite likely, they'll move it down. I don't see why that wouldn't be super probabilistic, given that they really haven't ever messed with this value before. They've never messed with this value before, and they made it higher this time. I bet the next time I put a change in, they're going to make it lower. But even if they don't, warriors are in a great spot. And also, some weapons have a magic damage portion to them, which I think might end up being a little interesting on these last few fights. But I'll talk more about that later. Maybe we'll have a fire damage warrior video in a couple days.